Today's episode features 3 of the darkest true crime stories that will leave you questioning reality itself. We start with a high school tragedy that took an unexpected turn, then move on to a case of international intrigue and widespread confusion. Finally, we journey to a small town where a shocking case ignited a firestorm of controversy. But before we dive into these stories, if you're a fan of the darkest true crime stories delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place. Please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories. On the chilly afternoon of January 13, 1999, 18-year-old Hae Min Lee kissed her mother goodbye and headed out the door, unaware that it would be the last time she would see her family. A high school senior at Woodlawn High School in Baltimore, Maryland, Hae was a bright and promising student known for her hardworking nature and warm personality. She had a future full of potential, but none of that seemed to matter as the day unfolded into a nightmare. By the time the evening rolled around, Hae had vanished. Her car was found parked near her school, but there was no sign of her. Friends and family grew frantic as the hours ticked by without a word from her. The cold reality set in. This wasn't just another late teenager out with friends. Something had gone terribly wrong. The last person to speak to her, according to phone records, was her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed, and the questions started almost immediately. Adnan and Hae had dated for a few months before breaking up, but they had remained in each other's lives. On that day, their interactions were innocent, 2 teenagers discussing the usual matters of high school and life. But after that, Adnan's account of what happened next became a mystery, with twists that would soon escalate into a tragic and complex investigation. By the time night fell, Hae's family was in panic mode, contacting authorities and scouring the area, looking for any trace of her. Hours turned into an agonizing wait with no word on where she could be. The police were called in, but initial efforts to trace her whereabouts were fruitless. Friends were questioned. Her belongings were searched, but Hae Min Lee was gone, and all anyone had was an unsettling silence that hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. The next morning, the news hit hard. Still, no sign of Hae, and now there was fear mixed with disbelief. A missing persons report was filed, but it wasn't just Hae's disappearance that raised alarm, it was the sheer randomness of it. A young woman, simply going about her day, had seemingly vanished without a trace. Where could she have gone? Was it a runaway situation? Or was something far darker at play? The police scoured the streets, re-interviewed friends, and began to piece together Hae's last movements. They learned that she had left school early, around 2:15 p.m., planning to meet with her friend Dawn, who later confirmed that they were supposed to hang out but never did. Her plans had shifted unexpectedly, and by 3:15 p.m., she had spoken to Adnan on the phone again. According to her friend, Aisha, Hae seemed to be in good spirits during their conversation. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then the clock seemed to stop. No one knew where Hae went after she hung up with Adnan, and the last recorded sighting of her was just a fleeting moment. Her car parked, but her body nowhere to be found. It was this void, this unanswered question, that gnawed everyone. How does a person just disappear in broad daylight? By the time the authorities had organized a more formal search, the darkness of the situation had already begun to set in. With every passing hour, hope dwindled, and the quiet, creeping suspicion began to take hold. Something terrible had happened to Hae Min Lee. With no answers, the investigation kicked into high gear, focusing on those closest to Hae, the people she knew, the people she had trusted. And Adnan Syed, who had been one of the last to speak with her, came under scrutiny. The relationship between Adnan and Hae was well known, though complicated. The two had ended their romantic relationship only a few weeks before her disappearance, but the bond between them had remained, at least on the surface. The question everyone wanted answered was simple. What happened after that final phone call? Had Hae left on her own accord, or had something far darker come into play? In the following days, investigators would uncover unsettling details that would lead them down a path filled with twists, contradictions, and ultimately a tangled web of accusations, doubt, and mistrust. As the search for Hae Min Lee intensified, the police began to zero in on the people closest to her, those who might have known something or seen something unusual. Among them was her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed. He was a quiet, often charismatic teenager, but his connection to Hae was one of the first things the investigators wanted to explore. After all, in many cases of missing persons, the most logical place to start was the last known contact. And in this case, that contact had been Adnan. The police quickly learned that Hae and Adnan had shared a complicated relationship. Although their romantic involvement had ended, they had continued to talk and spend time together. However, their interactions had been marked by tension, especially in the weeks leading up to Hae's disappearance. They had both moved on in their personal lives, yet the bond between them, one that had once seemed so solid, had frayed, leaving behind a volatile mix of unresolved emotions. Adnan's story from the start was both simple and filled with inconsistencies. He claimed that he had been at the library on the day Hae disappeared, studying for a history exam. According to his account, after his study session, he had left the library and had gone to meet his friend, Jay Wilds. This was the narrative he provided to the police, but it didn't take long for investigators to start questioning the details. There were gaps in his timeline that didn't make sense. Why, for example, had Adnan been so vague about his whereabouts during key parts of the afternoon? And why had he seemingly failed to remember what time he had left the library, something that should have been a clear detail for anyone in the midst of exam preparations? Investigators also learned that Adnan had called Hae earlier that day, but the timing of the phone call raised questions. Why had Hae, who was supposedly on her way to meet someone else, taken time out of her day to chat with her ex-boyfriend? And why was the conversation so innocuous? Couldn't she have just brushed him off if she was already planning to meet someone else? As the police dug deeper into the relationship between Adnan and Hae, they began to uncover new details that seemed to tell a different story. Friends and classmates from Woodlawn High, who had been close to Hae and Adnan, spoke out about strange behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. Some noticed that Adnan had been acting distant, while others reported strange interactions between the two. There were whispers of jealousy, of accusations, and of things left unsaid. Yet, there were also signs that the two had continued to care for each other, even after their breakup. Was this an ordinary teenage breakup that had spiraled out of control, or was there something more sinister at play? But it wasn't just Adnan's behavior that raised questions. The story began to shift as new witnesses came forward, offering their own accounts of the day. Jay Wilds, Adnan's friend, was one of the first people to speak up, but his testimony would become a key piece in unraveling the mystery. Jay claimed that Adnan had asked him for help. According to Jay, Adnan had called him after school and asked him to meet up. It was during this meeting that Jay allegedly learned that Adnan had something to do with Hae's disappearance. Jay's account was crucial, but it was also contradictory and unreliable. His story changed several times over the course of the investigation. At first, he claimed that he had only seen Adnan briefly on the afternoon Hae went missing, but later, his story evolved into something far more detailed and incriminating. Jay's changing testimony would become a source of doubt and controversy, but it was also the primary piece of evidence that would lead police to a devastating conclusion. As the investigation progressed, the timeline of events began to take shape. The police pieced together what little evidence they had: phone records, eyewitness testimony, and forensic evidence that seemed to confirm that Hae had been killed on that afternoon. Hae's body was eventually discovered in a wooded area in Leakin Park, a place that would later become infamous in the case. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation, but even the discovery of her body raised new questions. Why had Hae been left in such an isolated location? Who had led her there? And most importantly, why was it so difficult to pin down the truth? In the midst of the chaos, Adnan remained steadfast in his innocence. He denied any involvement in Hae's death, but his words were often met with skepticism. As police began to focus more intently on him, the pieces of his story started to fall apart. The inconsistencies in his alibis, the shifting accounts of his whereabouts, and the damning testimony from Jay Wilds all combined to paint a troubling picture. The mounting evidence and the growing suspicion surrounding Adnan's involvement in Hae's murder were undeniable, but there was still a sense of ambiguity. Was Adnan guilty? Or had the investigation been rushed, too eager to find someone to blame? This question loomed over the entire case, and the more the police dug, the more unclear the truth seemed to become. Every lead they followed, every piece of evidence they uncovered, only seemed to raise more questions. Despite the mounting tension and the pressure from the community, the investigation didn't provide any immediate clarity. And as the weeks stretched into months, the case grew even more complicated. The truth behind Hae Min Lee's disappearance and the events that led to her tragic death was far from certain. But one thing was clear: the journey to uncover the truth would be a long and arduous one, filled with twists, turns, and shocking revelations that no one could have predicted. The discovery of Hae Min Lee's body in Leakin Park sent shockwaves through the investigation, marking a pivotal point in the case. The park, located on the outskirts of Baltimore, was an area that had long been known for its desolate and overgrown terrain. It was a place where few ventured, making it the perfect location to hide a body. But its eerie, forgotten nature only added to the mystery surrounding Hae's death. No one could understand why she had been brought there, or who had led her into that remote part of the wood. It was late February 1999 when Hae's body was discovered. The police were led to the area by a combination of tips, circumstantial evidence, and perhaps most crucially, Jay Wilde's testimony. According to Jay, it was here, this lonely, shadowy place, where Adnan had taken Hae's life, then gone to extreme lengths to cover it up. Yet, as detectives surveyed the crime scene, they found themselves faced with as many questions as answers. Forensic evidence painted a grim picture. Hae's body had been partially buried under branches and leaves, which suggested the killer had tried to hide it. Yet, the body had still been exposed enough to be discovered by a passerby. There was no sign of a struggle at the scene, no blood spatter that could point to an altercation. The cause of death was determined to be manual strangulation, a method that would have required the victim to be immobilized, either through force or surprise. What was most puzzling, however, was the lack of any defensive wounds on Hae's body. If she had been caught off guard, it seemed she hadn't fought back at all. This detail would become a crucial piece of the puzzle, as it added an element of unpredictability to the situation. Was it possible that Hae had gone willingly with her killer? Had she trusted Adnan enough, in their final moments together, to allow him to get close without raising alarm? Or was there more to the story, something that no one yet understood? While the forensic team worked to process the scene, investigators turned to the timeline. The pieces of Hae's final hours were slowly being put together, though they still seemed out of reach. The key to unlocking her death, they believed, lay in understanding what had happened after she left school that afternoon. According to Jay, Adnan had contacted him to meet, and the two spent several hours together after Hae disappeared. But how did they get from a routine meeting to the murder of a teenager? Jay's testimony was once again a focal point. He had described how Adnan had picked him up from his house and driven to the area where Hae's body would later be found. But his story, like many others, was riddled with holes. His account of what happened was inconsistent, with the details changing depending on who was asking. At one point, Jay claimed that he had not been present at the scene of the murder, but later, he described seeing Adnan bury Hae's body. The contradictions in Jay's story were enough to make anyone question his credibility, and the detectives were no exception. Was Jay telling the truth, or was he trying to protect someone, or cover his own tracks? The more investigators dug into Jay's role, the murkier the situation became. He had been a key figure in Adnan's life, a friend who had allegedly helped him cover up the murder. Jay claimed that after the killing, Adnan had asked him to help dispose of the body, a task that had clearly left its mark on him. But the inconsistencies in Jay's recollection made it difficult to piece together a clear narrative. Was he merely a reluctant accomplice? Or was he simply a confused witness, unable to fully recall the events of that day? The only thing that seemed clear was that the truth was far more elusive than anyone had anticipated. Meanwhile, Adnan's defense team began to build their case. Adnan continued to deny any involvement in Hae's death, insisting that he had been at the library during the crucial time window. His alibi, though shaky, was the cornerstone of his defense. He had been studying for a history exam, and there were people who had supposedly seen him there. But the prosecution didn't buy it. They argued that the timing didn't add up, and that Adnan's relationship with Hae, complicated and strained, provided a motive for murder. The more the prosecution and defense squared off, the more the trial appeared to hinge on what happened in those critical hours between when Hae left school and when her body was found. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, there were still gaps that couldn't be filled. Investigators continued to chase down leads, but nothing about the case seemed simple. The timeline didn't make sense. Jay's testimony was unreliable. And most troubling of all, the police had yet to recover any physical evidence linking Adnan to Hae's murder. There were no fingerprints on her car, no DNA evidence at the crime scene. All they had were vague recollections and conflicting stories. The longer the case dragged on, the more the public's interest in it grew. As news outlets reported on the unfolding drama, the details of Hae Min Lee's death began to seep into the public consciousness. People wondered, was Adnan Syed guilty? Or was he simply a victim of an investigation gone wrong, a pawn in a much larger game of criminal justice? The trial, which had initially seemed straightforward, had now become a spectacle. A trial not just for Adnan, but for the very system that was supposed to protect the innocent. And in the midst of all this, Hae's family struggled to make sense of their loss. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a friend. And while the investigation had focused primarily on the circumstances of her death, her family mourned the life that had been taken far too soon. For them, the questions of who did it and why were almost secondary to the pain of not having her around. The investigation had hit a crucial turning point. The discovery of Hae Min Lee's body in Leakin Park had brought the case into sharper focus, but it had also opened up new questions, ones that would only deepen as the trial progressed. With each passing day, the search for the truth seemed to take a darker, more complicated turn. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the case of Hae Min Lee's murder took an unsettling turn as it entered the courtroom. The trial of Adnan Syed was set to begin in December 1999, and it quickly became a media sensation, drawing attention from across the country. The questions surrounding his guilt were no longer just a matter for the police and legal system to answer. They had become part of a larger public spectacle. At the center of it all was Adnan Syed, a young man who seemed to be both a suspect and a symbol of something much bigger, the potential flaws in the criminal justice system. He sat in the defendant's chair, a 17-year-old facing charges of first-degree murder, with a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with the high stakes of the trial. The courtroom was tense, charged with the weight of the accusations against him, yet Adnan maintained an air of disconnection. His defense team had one goal: to prove that there was simply no conclusive evidence to link him to Hae's death. The prosecution, on the other hand, came armed with circumstantial evidence they believed would be enough to secure a conviction. The centerpiece of their case was the testimony of Jay Wilds, the friend who claimed to have helped Adnan dispose of Hae's body. Jay's statements had already proven to be inconsistent, but the prosecution believed that his testimony, coupled with the circumstantial evidence they had gathered, would paint a damning picture of Adnan's involvement in the crime. Jay's role in the trial was pivotal. He was the key witness, the person who claimed to have been with Adnan during crucial moments after Hae's disappearance. He testified that Adnan had confessed to him that he had killed Hae, and then had enlisted his help to dispose of her body. The details of Jay's story were as vivid as they were troubling. According to him, he had driven with Adnan to Leakin Park, where they buried Hae's body in a secluded area. The timeline Jay provided, though, was riddled with inconsistencies. At first, he claimed that he had no idea what had happened to Hae, but later, his account changed, and he became the central figure in Adnan's alleged cover-up. The defense wasted no time tearing into Jay's credibility. They pointed out the contradictions in his testimony and the fact that his story had changed multiple times throughout the investigation. They also emphasized that Jay had a history of legal trouble himself, and some suggested that his motive for helping the police was not just about being a good citizen, but about saving his own skin. His shifting narrative was problematic, and the defense team argued that Jay's testimony couldn't be trusted. Adnan's defense also highlighted the lack of physical evidence linking him to the crime. There were no fingerprints on Hae's car, no DNA found at the crime scene, and no concrete proof that Adnan had ever even been near Leakin Park that day. Despite Jay's testimony, the prosecution had little else to offer. No forensics, no eyewitnesses, no solid connection between Adnan and the murder. The lack of direct evidence was a major obstacle, but the prosecution leaned heavily on Jay's account, hoping that it would fill in the blanks. As the trial continued, Adnan's family and friends watched with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. They had all known him as a quiet, kind-hearted teenager, someone who had never shown signs of violence or aggression. To see him portrayed as a cold-blooded murderer in court was not just a shock, it was a betrayal of everything they believed about him. Adnan himself seemed to be trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from, caught between the weight of the accusations against him and the growing uncertainty of whether he would ever see freedom again. The prosecution and defense clashed over every detail, from the time Adnan and Jay spent together to the nature of Adnan and Hae's relationship. The defense team worked hard to make the case that Adnan had no motive to kill Hae, arguing that their breakup had been amicable and that there was no clear reason why he would suddenly resort to violence. But the prosecution countered by suggesting that the breakup had been more tumultuous than anyone had realized. Adnan, they argued, was angry and resentful, and in a moment of rage, he may have decided to kill Hae. Throughout the trial, one thing became increasingly clear. The case was built largely on speculation. With no direct evidence linking Adnan to the crime, both sides were left to fill in the gaps with their own theories. The prosecution painted a picture of a jealous ex-boyfriend who had planned and executed the murder, while the defense portrayed a young man who was being wrongfully accused of a crime he didn't commit. But the trial was far from over. As the days passed, the case took a dramatic turn when the defense brought in a crucial alibi witness, Asia McLean. Asia was a classmate of Adnan's who claimed that she had seen him at the Woodlawn Library on the afternoon of January 13, 1999, during the time Hae was believed to have been murdered. Asia's testimony was vital because it contradicted the timeline provided by Jay and suggested that Adnan had been somewhere else entirely when the crime occurred. However, Asia's testimony was never fully explored during the trial. She was never called to the stand, and her potential to provide an airtight alibi for Adnan was ignored, leaving a significant hole in the defense's case. As the trial reached its climax, the jury was left with a difficult decision. Was Adnan Syed guilty of murder, or was he a victim of a flawed investigation and an unreliable witness? The decision would not be an easy one, and as deliberations stretched into hours, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. In the end, it wasn't the lack of physical evidence that sealed Adnan's fate, nor was it the inconsistencies in Jay's testimony. It was the portrayal of a young man who, despite his protestations of innocence, was seen by many as the only logical suspect in a case that had captivated the nation. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as Adnan was sentenced to life in prison. His family, devastated by the verdict, fought back tears as they left the courtroom. For them, the conviction was not just a legal blow, it was the end of a long, painful search for justice. But as the dust settled, the questions surrounding Adnan's guilt or innocence only grew louder. Was he truly the murderer, or had the prosecution relied too heavily on a shaky witness? And why had crucial pieces of evidence, like Asia's testimony, been overlooked? The answers to these questions would remain elusive, but the case was far from over. Even as Adnan began serving his sentence, the seeds of doubt were already being planted, doubt that would eventually lead to a dramatic re-examination of the case. In the years that followed, the mystery of Hae Min Lee's murder would continue to haunt not just Adnan, but the entire criminal justice system. With so many unanswered questions, the case would become a symbol of the complexities of truth, the dangers of wrongful convictions, and the relentless pursuit of justice. As Adnan Syed sat behind bars, convicted of a crime he had always insisted he didn't commit, the case seemed to fade into the background of the public's consciousness. However, just as time began to dull the pain for some, it sparked a fire for others. The case of Hae Min Lee's murder and the conviction of Adnan Syed would resurface in ways no one had anticipated, leading to a resurgence of public interest and an outpouring of doubt. It all started in 2014, when journalist Sarah Koenig launched a podcast titled Gyn Serial Danger. This podcast, a deep dive into the case, would reawaken the questions surrounding Adnan's conviction, leading millions of listeners to revisit the details of the case one by one. Serialing would go on to become a cultural phenomenon, captivating a wide audience who had never before heard of Adnan or Hae. But for those who had followed the case, the podcast was a revelation. Koenig's investigation uncovered new details, raised new questions, and most importantly, gave voice to the doubts that had always lingered about Adnan's guilt. Through the podcast, listeners were introduced to a much more complex narrative than the one presented during the trial. Koenig examined the inconsistencies in Jay Wilde's testimony, the flawed investigation that had led to Adnan's conviction, and the overlooked alibi that could have exonerated him. With each episode, a growing chorus of people began to question whether Adnan had been wrongfully convicted and whether the true killer had never been found. One of the most compelling aspects of iSerial was its exploration of the legal system and how it had failed to protect Adnan. The podcast raised troubling questions about the fairness of the investigation, the prosecution's reliance on a questionable witness, and the defense's failure to properly explore exonerating evidence. As Koenig delved deeper into the case, listeners began to see the full picture of how a young man's life could be destroyed by a flawed criminal justice system. The more the podcast uncovered, the more it seemed that Adnan's conviction had been built on shaky ground, and that the truth was far more elusive than anyone had realized. But it wasn't just the flaws in the case that captured people's attention, it was the sheer mystery of it all. Why had Hae been killed in the first place? Who was responsible for her death? And how could someone like Adnan, a teenager with no violent history, be linked to such a brutal crime? As listeners tuned in each week, they became more invested in solving the case. They became detectives themselves, poring over the details and trying to piece together the truth. Adnan's fate was no longer just a matter for the courts to decide, it had become a public obsession. In the wake of the podcast's release, public opinion began to shift. More and more people started to believe that Adnan might not be guilty after all. A grassroots movement formed, calling for a new trial, and eventually, the case was re-examined. In 2016, the Maryland Court of Appeals ruled that Adnan's conviction should be reviewed, citing the fact that his defense team had failed to investigate crucial evidence during the trial, particularly the testimony of Asia McClain, who had claimed she had seen Adnan at the... As the case began to gain renewed attention, Adnan's legal team pushed for a new trial. The legal process, however, would drag on for years. Despite the overwhelming public interest in his case and the growing sense that justice had been denied, Adnan remained incarcerated, fighting for a chance at freedom. His supporters rallied behind him, organizing petitions, raising awareness on social media, and demanding that the legal system take another look at the evidence. They believed in his innocence and were determined to see him set free. In 2018, the Maryland courts made a groundbreaking decision. They ruled that Adnan's conviction should be vacated. The decision was based largely on the failure of his original defense team to investigate Asia McClain's alibi and the new evidence that had surfaced in the years following the trial. The ruling didn't immediately free Adnan, but it was a significant victory in the ongoing battle for justice. It was a step toward overturning a conviction that many believed had been wrongfully obtained. Yet, even with this ruling, the case was far from over. Adnan's fate was still in the hands of the courts, and the questions about who killed Hae Min Lee remained unanswered. While some celebrated the progress in Adnan's case, others pointed out that the true story of what happened to Hae had yet to be told. The mystery of her death, who had taken her life, why and how, was still shrouded in darkness. Was Adnan truly innocent, or had the courts simply failed to convict the right person? With each new twist, the case became even more tangled, with no clear resolution in sight. The case of Adnan Syed and Hae Min Lee became a symbol not only of a possible wrongful conviction, but of the larger flaws in the criminal justice system. It raised fundamental questions about fairness, accountability, and the potential for human error in every step of a criminal investigation. For Adnan, it was a fight for his life, a fight that had already spanned over 2 decades, and one that still wasn't over. As the years passed, the case of Hae Min Lee's murder continued to captivate the public, drawing in new generations of listeners, viewers, and online sleuths. The saga of Adnan Syed's conviction and the mystery of Hae's death remained a haunting and unresolved chapter in the history of true crime. And even as legal battles continued, the questions lingered. What really happened to Hae Min Lee? Who killed her? And why? And most crucially, was Adnan Syed truly innocent, or had he been wrongfully exonerated? As the search for the truth pressed on, it was clear that this was a story that would not be easily forgotten or solved. The next story is called Amanda Knox Case. On the night of November 2, 2007, the small college town of Perugia, Italy, was about to be thrust into the global spotlight. At the heart of this tragedy was a crime so brutal, its implications would echo far beyond the streets of Italy. Meredith Kercher, a 21-year-old British student, had been living in Perugia for just a few months, studying abroad. She shared an apartment with her American roommate, Amanda Knox, a 20-year-old from Seattle. But that night, Amanda had plans with her boyfriend, Rafael Solicito. They were spending time together, away from the apartment. When Amanda and Rafael returned to the house later that evening, it should have been a normal evening, except it wasn't. The door to the apartment was unlocked. There was an odd smell in the air, something foreign and disturbing. But it wasn't until they made their way into Meredith's bedroom that everything would come to a horrifying halt. What they found was the lifeless body of Meredith Kercher. She lay sprawled on the floor, a pool of blood surrounding her. The scene was gruesome. Her throat had been slashed. It was clear Meredith had fought for her life, her body showing signs of a violent struggle. But in the end, it hadn't been enough. In a state of shock, Amanda immediately called her friend, and then the police. But the scene she had walked into, a crime scene so chaotic, would unravel a series of events that would haunt her for years to come. Amanda, terrified, confused, and in a panic, had no idea that her life was about to change forever. The police arrived quickly, but things began to spiral even faster. At first, the investigation seemed to follow a logical course. Meredith had been murdered by a stranger. But then, something began to feel off. When investigators began questioning Amanda, they started to focus on her behavior. She didn't seem devastated enough, or at least not in the way they expected. She was too calm, too composed. At least that's how it appeared to them. As they searched the apartment, they found evidence that would begin to frame Amanda and Rafael as prime suspects. A bloody handprint, fingerprints on the door, and DNA evidence found in unexpected places. There were signs that the crime scene had been tampered with. And then there was the most unsettling piece, a knife found in Rafael's apartment that would later become the focal point of the case. But there was no clear-cut evidence. No smoking gun. No one could say for sure that Amanda and Rafael had done this. Yet, the investigation took an odd turn when police began to question Amanda more intensely, pushing her into a corner. The interrogation grew more hostile. In the pressure of the moment, the pressure to confess, Amanda's words became increasingly unclear. What followed was a confession, one that she would later recant, saying it had been coerced. Amanda's account of that night began to shift, and so did the public perception. To the police, it appeared as though the American exchange student had blood on her hands. The media was already calling her Foxy Knoxy, and the press in Italy had latched onto her as the face of the crime. The images of her, smiling in photos or acting out of place, became the public narrative. In a country with a history of sensationalized trials, the media machine was already turning, fueling the belief that Amanda had played a role in Meredith's death. But why? Why would Amanda, a student so far from home, be involved in something so horrific? The police had theories. They believed there was a sexual motive, that the crime had escalated out of control. But there were holes in the evidence, inconsistencies in the timeline. And yet, that didn't stop the authorities from moving forward. Amanda and Rafael were arrested. Days turned into weeks as the trial began to take shape. Media attention was relentless, and Amanda became a household name, not just in Italy, but around the world. Her face, her smile, was plastered across every tabloid. The very face of innocence, now labeled with the presumption of guilt. There was no turning back for Amanda Knox. From that moment, her life would never be the same. The world watched, waiting for the truth to unfold, but the question remained, was she guilty of this horrific crime? Or was she the victim of a miscarriage of justice? The more investigators dug, the more questions arose. The evidence that had first seemed damning started to fall apart. The knife that seemed to tie Amanda to the crime scene, had it been planted? Was it even the murder weapon? The forensic evidence, was it flawed? Was it possible that someone else had committed the murder, and Amanda had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? The more they dug, the more the story seemed to spiral into uncertainty. But the arrest of Amanda Knox was only the beginning of a much larger mystery. What had really happened in that apartment on the night of November 2nd, 2007? And why, after all this time, had the truth remained so elusive? It wouldn't be long before the world would find out that this was only the start of a much more complicated case, one filled with twists, turns, and a tangled web of forensic evidence, false confessions, and media manipulation. But in those early days, all that anyone knew for sure was this: Meredith Kercher had been brutally murdered, and Amanda Knox was now at the center of the storm. The investigation was just beginning, and Amanda Knox, whether she was guilty or innocent, was already on a path that would change everything. In the days following the discovery of Meredith Kercher's body, the small town of Perugia was rocked by the growing controversy surrounding the case. Amanda Knox and her boyfriend, Raffaele Solicito, found themselves under the microscope of Italian authorities, their every move scrutinized. As the police began piecing together the timeline of that fateful night, one thing became painfully clear. The more they questioned Amanda, the more inconsistencies arose in her story. To the investigators, Amanda's behavior was odd, too composed for someone who had just discovered a close friend's body in such a violent way. She didn't seem as distraught as they expected. She wasn't crying, she wasn't showing the typical signs of grief. And to the police, this was suspicious. They began to focus more intently on her, probing her every word and action, trying to find the cracks in her narrative. Amanda had always been an open book, cheerful and outgoing. But that very openness, combined with her youthful exuberance, began to work against her. In the pressure cooker environment of a police interrogation, Amanda's initial statements began to unravel. She would later say that the police had badgered her, that they had misinterpreted her answers and coerced her into saying things she didn't mean. But in that moment, Amanda didn't seem to have a clear explanation for why her story kept shifting. It wasn't just the inconsistencies that had the police focused on her. It was also the fact that Amanda seemed so calm. They couldn't understand how someone could be so level-headed after finding their roommate murdered in such a horrific way. In the face of this strange behavior, they started to zero in on her. What was she hiding? What were they missing? The media, eager to find a scapegoat, quickly seized on Amanda as the prime suspect. Tabloids and news outlets latched onto the bizarre details of the case: Amanda's supposedly odd behavior, her flirtations with Raffaele, the youthful naivete that seemed to contrast with the gruesome murder. Headlines like "Foxy Knoxy" and "The Girl Who Killed" splashed across newspapers and TV screens. The public, hungry for a story, had already convicted her in their minds. At the same time, the police pushed forward, convinced that Amanda and Raffaele were involved. Their theory was that the crime had started as a sexual assault that went horribly wrong. A robbery gone awry, a crime of passion. The more they delved into the evidence, the more convinced they became that Amanda was somehow complicit in Meredith's death. They believed that she had staged the scene, perhaps even participated in the crime herself. Why? Then came the bombshell, the confession. Under intense questioning, Amanda broke down. Or at least, that's how it seemed. With no lawyer present, and after hours of grueling interrogation, Amanda signed a statement that was later used against her in court. In that moment of exhaustion, confusion, and fear, she said things that didn't make sense. She claimed she had been present during the murder, that she had seen the events unfold. But later, Amanda would insist that this confession was not her own. She had been coerced, manipulated into saying what the police wanted to hear. But the damage was already done. The public perception of Amanda began to solidify. The world watched as the Italian justice system seemed to close in on her, and media coverage intensified. The idea of Amanda Knox as the Foxy Knoxy murderer took hold. Her smile, her upbeat demeanor, her foreignness, they all painted a picture that didn't fit the image of an innocent young woman. The authorities were sure they had their killer, and the press was only too happy to feed into that narrative. But there were cracks in the case. The evidence, upon closer inspection, was not as solid as it seemed. The knife found in Raffaele's apartment, a key piece of the prosecution's argument, was far from a clear match to the crime scene. There was no DNA from Meredith on the blade, no clear proof that it had been the weapon used to murder her. Then there was the DNA evidence found in the apartment. Amanda's prints, Raffaele's, and Meredith's were all over the place, but that was hardly unusual for people who lived together. The investigators tried to link the blood spatter on Amanda's clothes, but the timeline didn't add up. There was no way she could have been in the apartment when Meredith was murdered, let alone have been the one to carry out the crime. The inconsistencies only multiplied, and yet, the focus on Amanda didn't let up. Her trial was a spectacle. The media frenzy around Amanda was relentless, and public opinion had already been shaped. It didn't matter what the evidence showed or didn't show. To many, Amanda had already been tried and convicted by the court of public opinion. But, behind the scenes, her defense team was working tirelessly to prove her innocence. They fought tooth and nail to show that Amanda had been wrongfully accused, that the evidence simply didn't support the prosecution's theory. They argued that the confession was invalid, that the police had acted improperly, and that Amanda had been a victim of circumstance. Yet, as the trial proceeded, the weight of the media circus and public scrutiny made it harder for the truth to break through. Amanda's life was falling apart. The charges against her weighed heavily, and every day in prison felt like a never-ending nightmare. She had been thrust into a world of darkness, a world where her every move was watched, and her name had become synonymous with murder. As the pressure mounted, one thing became clear. Amanda Knox was no longer just a student from Seattle. She had become the face of a case that had captivated the world, a case where justice, truth, and innocence had all been lost in the chaos of speculation, media sensationalism, and a flawed investigation. But amidst the noise and the fury, the question remained, was Amanda Knox guilty of murder? Or was she the victim of a system that had already decided her fate before the truth could ever be known? And the trial was only the beginning. The trial of Amanda Knox was a circus, an endless media frenzy that overshadowed the very essence of what a trial should be. With every new day, the courtroom drama unfolded like a tabloid story, weaving a narrative that seemed more suited to reality television than a serious criminal case. The court was filled with press, eager to capture Amanda's every gesture, every glance, every word. And the story being told was one that blurred the line between truth and spectacle. Amanda Knox, sitting in the defendant's chair, was no longer just a young woman accused of murder. She was a symbol, a character created by the media. The prosecution painted her as the quintessential bad girl, a cold, calculating, and promiscuous American who had brutally murdered her roommate, Meredith Kercher, in a drug-fueled orgy of violence. It was the story that fit into the narrative of a depraved foreigner, corrupted by Italy's darker side. The media loved it. And so, the trial proceeded under the heavy weight of public opinion, a public convinced of Amanda's guilt. But there was a problem. The evidence against Amanda wasn't as solid as the prosecution claimed. At the heart of the case were two key pieces of evidence: the murder weapon, a knife found in Rafael Solicito's apartment, and the DNA found at the crime scene. The knife, however, wasn't a clear match to the crime. Despite the forensic team's insistence, there was no definitive proof that this knife had caused Meredith's fatal injuries. The blood on the blade, while it seemed damning at first glance, didn't belong to Meredith. There were discrepancies in how the evidence was handled and interpreted, creating doubt about the validity of the findings. But instead of casting doubt on the prosecution's case, these inconsistencies were downplayed. DNA evidence, on the other hand, was being used to tie Amanda to the crime scene. Amanda's DNA was found on a bra strap, and Rafael's on a pillowcase. But there was a problem with this evidence too. Why? The DNA samples were not as clear-cut as they appeared. Were these traces from the night of the murder, or had they been transferred earlier? The investigation had been sloppy, Naa was mishandled, and there were lapses in procedure that made the evidence unreliable. But, in the court of public opinion, the DNA was enough. People saw what they wanted to see. They saw the face of a killer, not a confused, terrified young woman caught in a web of misunderstandings and mistakes. Meanwhile, Amanda's defense team fought tooth and nail to clear her name. They argued that the case against her was full of holes, that the prosecution was grasping at straws. They called into question the integrity of the evidence and the tactics used during Amanda's police interrogation. They also pointed out the glaring absence of any clear motive. There was no reason for Amanda to want to kill Meredith. They asked the crucial question: if Amanda had been involved in Meredith's murder, why had she not shown any signs of guilt? Why had she never shown any violent tendencies? The case simply didn't add up. But in a trial so deeply tainted by the press, by public opinion, and by the need for a scapegoat, it was difficult for the truth to break through. The world had already made up its mind. Baltimore. In Italy, where the media thrived on sensational stories, the spectacle surrounding Amanda's trial became impossible to escape. The defense, no matter how hard they fought, couldn't undo the damage done by the media's portrayal of Amanda as the killer. The prosecution capitalized on this, feeding into the narrative and allowing the public's perception of Amanda to become part of the case against her. Throughout the trial, Amanda sat in the defendant's chair, her emotions barely contained. She would later admit how the pressure, the isolation, the constant public scrutiny took a toll on her. She felt like she was losing herself, that her very identity was being stripped away. Every time the media flashed her face across the screen, every time the courtroom was filled with whispers, every time the prosecutors painted her as a cold-blooded killer, she felt as though she was disappearing. She wasn't Amanda Knox anymore. She was Foxy Knoxy, the girl who killed her friend in a fit of rage. But the emotional toll wasn't just internal. The trial took its toll on Amanda's relationship with Raphael as well. As the days stretched into months, the couple began to crack under the pressure. Raphael, who had always supported Amanda, now found himself caught in a whirlwind of confusion. They both faced a system that seemed to want to convict them no matter what. In private, Amanda and Raphael tried to maintain some semblance of normality, but the weight of the case was unbearable. The media scrutiny didn't let up, and the emotional strain from both the trial and the uncertainty of their fates began to break them down. They were both accused of something they didn't do, yet the evidence seemed to point in their direction. Amanda began to question everything: her actions, her words, her life in Italy. And as the trial went on, she felt herself becoming smaller, swallowed by the uncertainty and fear that gripped her. But as the defense team argued their case, it became increasingly clear that the prosecution was running out of solid ground to stand on. The timeline of the murder wasn't adding up. The DNA evidence, which had seemed like the key to convicting Amanda, was weak and inconclusive, and the supposed confession, made under duress, was starting to unravel. With every new development, the case against Amanda seemed more and more fragile. Still, the damage had been done. Amanda had already been painted as the villain, and in the eyes of many, there was no going back. No amount of evidence, no matter how damning it was to the prosecution's case, could undo the narrative that had been built around her. The world had already made up its mind, and as the trial neared its end, Amanda was left wondering if there was any chance for her to escape this nightmare. The question remained: was the real killer still out there, or had the justice system been so warped by its own rush to judgment that it had condemned an innocent person to prison? Amanda's fate hung in the balance. The trial had come to a dramatic and tense conclusion. In 2009, the court returned its verdict. Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito were both found guilty of the murder of Meredith Kercher. For Amanda, the ruling was a crushing blow. She was sentenced to 26 years in prison, while Raphael received 25 years. The world watched, transfixed, as the young American was led away, her future uncertain, her innocence still in question. But the conviction didn't mark the end of the story. If anything, it was only the beginning of an even more complicated and drawn-out battle. The decision set in motion a series of appeals that would drag on for years, keeping the public and media on edge. Amanda's fate seemed sealed, at least for the moment, but the cracks in the prosecution's case, already apparent during the trial, began to widen. For Amanda, every day in prison was a suffocating reminder of the injustice she felt had been done to her. The harsh conditions of the Italian prison system, the relentless isolation, and the constant barrage of media coverage were taking their toll. Amanda, who had once been a bright-eyed student with dreams of an adventurous life abroad, was now a prisoner in a foreign land, fighting not just for her freedom, but for her very identity. Every press release, every tabloid headline, every flashbulb from the cameras stripped away more of the person she used to be. The world had created a monster out of her, a monster she didn't recognize. Meanwhile, the appeals process began to unfold with its own twists and turns. Amanda's legal team, led by the determined and experienced lawyer Luciano Kirga, argued relentlessly that the evidence against her had been mishandled, misinterpreted, and in some cases, fabricated. The defense pointed out the numerous flaws in the prosecution's case, from the questionable forensic evidence to the dubious police procedures during Amanda's interrogation. They argued that the confession Amanda had made under duress was not only unreliable, but also irrelevant. It was a statement that, in their view, should never have been admissible in court. But the cracks in the case didn't stop there. As the appeal hearings continued, the prosecution's case continued to crumble under scrutiny. The key evidence, the infamous knife found in Rafael's apartment, was called into question again. DNA evidence that supposedly linked Amanda to the crime scene was discredited by a team of independent forensic experts who cast doubt on the validity of the findings. The defense team argued that the evidence, far from proving Amanda's guilt, could not definitively tie her to the murder. The public, however, remained largely unconvinced. The trial and the media frenzy had already done their damage. People had made up their minds. Amanda Knox was the face of this tragedy, the girl who had betrayed her friend and taken a life. Her image was permanently linked to the crime, whether or not she had actually committed it. Her very presence in the media was a reminder to the public that regardless of what was happening in the courtrooms, the world had already decided. The media, in particular, had no interest in stepping back from its portrayal of Amanda as the foxy Knoxy killer. The press ran with sensational headlines, painting Amanda as everything from a psychopath to a femme fatale. The term foxy Knoxy had become her new identity, one that she could neither escape nor deny. The more the trial dragged on, the more her character seemed to be swallowed by the media narrative. Amanda was a creation of the tabloids, a character who existed not as a real person, but as a figure constructed by the public's need for a villain. As the years passed, Amanda found herself in a strange and terrifying limbo. She wasn't just fighting the justice system anymore. She was fighting a public perception that had taken on a life of its own. Even as her legal team uncovered new evidence that pointed to her innocence, Amanda's own sense of self was being eroded by the ongoing coverage. Her thoughts were consumed by the fear that the truth would never be enough to change the public's opinion of her. But, despite the weight of the world bearing down on her, Amanda's legal battle continued. In 2011, after years of procedural delays, the Italian appellate court finally reviewed the evidence, and in a stunning reversal, the conviction was overturned. Amanda was acquitted of all charges. The court declared that there was not enough evidence to convict her, and the case against her had been based on flawed and unreliable evidence. Amanda was free to go, but the cost of that freedom was unimaginable. Her release from prison was met with a mix of celebration and outrage. For Amanda, the moment was surreal. She had been through hell and back, and yet the nightmare wasn't truly over. The damage to her life, her reputation, her sense of who she was, had already been done. She had been portrayed as a murderer, a monster, and even after her release, she couldn't escape that label. She was free physically, but the emotional scars remained. The world had been watching when she was sentenced, and now the world would watch as she was freed. But even as she walked out of the prison gates, the question lingered. Was she truly innocent, or had the system simply failed to make a clear case against her? Amanda tried to rebuild her life, but the shadow of the trial loomed over her at every turn. She had been exonerated in the eyes of the law, but in the court of public opinion, she would never be fully absolved. The media didn't simply move on. It continued to spin its own version of events, keeping Amanda in the public eye, making it difficult for her to live a normal life. The damage to her mental health was profound. Amanda would later talk openly about how the experience had shattered her, how it had made her question everything. She would speak about the loneliness of being in prison, the constant uncertainty, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal she felt, not just from the justice system, but from a world that had already decided her fate. Yet, through it all, Amanda Knox was determined to keep moving forward. She refused to let the past completely define her. She became a symbol, not just of wrongful conviction, but of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. In the years that followed, Amanda tried to rebuild her life, become a voice for those who had been wrongfully accused, and reclaim her narrative from the media. It was a long and painful process, but with each passing year, Amanda worked to regain control of her story. But the haunting question remained: who then had really killed Meredith Kercher? With Amanda's acquittal, the case seemed as unresolved as ever, a mystery that would never truly fade from the public consciousness. In the aftermath of her acquittal, Amanda Knox stepped into a world that seemed irrevocably changed. The years she had spent in an Italian prison were like a lost chapter in her life, an endless nightmare of isolation and fear that had stripped her of her sense of self. But even though she was free physically, the psychological scars ran deep. Her name was now synonymous with controversy, and her face was still plastered on the covers of tabloids around the world. For all the joy of being released, Amanda was trapped in a cage of public perception. She was free, but the prison of the media never released its grip on her. The immediate aftermath of her release was surreal. Amanda stood before the cameras, her heart pounding in her chest as she faced the international press. She had been acquitted, but the air was thick with questions. Was she truly innocent, or had the system failed to prosecute her properly? The media, ever hungry for a story, couldn't let go of the mystery. They had already formed their own narrative, and no amount of legal resolution seemed capable of changing it. Some celebrated her acquittal as a triumph of justice, but for many, the question still lingered: was she guilty of murder, or had she simply been lucky? Amanda knew better than anyone how much the truth had been distorted. The trial, the media, and the public's endless speculation had taken something precious from her. It wasn't just her freedom that had been stolen, it was her identity. In the years leading up to her acquittal, she had been dehumanized, turned into a symbol of everything that went wrong with the justice system, with the media's thirst for scandal. And in the aftermath, despite her freedom, she found it nearly impossible to reclaim the life she had once known. The case itself, despite her release, had never truly been closed. Questions still loomed about who had killed Meredith Kercher. The Italian authorities, after all, had never found the definitive answers they were looking for. The shadow of the case continued to haunt Perugia, and the lingering mysteries surrounding Meredith's murder, like who had actually committed the crime and why, left the world restless. In the years that followed her acquittal, Amanda would try to move forward, to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. She returned to the United States, where she enrolled in college and began to write a memoir, You Waiting to Be Hurting, a raw and deeply personal account of her time in prison, her trial, and her fight for freedom. But as she tried to rebuild her life, she found herself constantly drawn back into the public eye. The media refused to let her go. Even now, she was still Foxy Knoxy, the girl who had been accused of murdering her friend, the girl whose story had been written for her by the tabloids. The public had spent years shaping the narrative, and even her release did little to shift the perception. The damage had been done. She had been branded as a villain in the eyes of many, a girl who had gone through the trial by fire and emerged unscathed, but at what cost? For Amanda, the struggle was about more than just proving her innocence. It was about reclaiming her humanity. The world had watched as she was stripped of her dignity, her name dragged through the mud. The battle for her freedom had been a battle for her very sense of self. Even though the legal system had cleared her, the emotional toll of those years, of being accused, convicted, and then released, was something she could never undo. Amanda found herself fighting against two battles, the battle for her own peace of mind, and the battle for her reputation. It was a strange limbo, to be declared innocent by the courts, but still condemned by the world. No matter how many times she tried to explain herself, to show the world who she truly was, the scars of those years wouldn't fade. One of the most painful aspects of the aftermath was how the case continued to affect the people around her. Raffaele Solecito, her former boyfriend, had been in prison alongside her, but like Amanda, his life was forever marked by the accusations. Their relationship had suffered, strained by the pressure of the case, and though they tried to remain close, the damage was irreparable. They both found themselves battling their own personal demons as they tried to make sense of what had happened, and how their lives had been turned upside down by a crime neither of them committed. Meredith Kercher's family, too, was left in limbo. The tragic loss of Meredith had never been fully resolved, and the truth about her death was still out there, somewhere. Despite the acquittal, the case left lingering questions about who had actually been responsible for her murder. For the Kercher family, the closure they had hoped for remained elusive, and that sense of unresolved grief never truly went away. They, too, had been caught in the media's web, their grief overshadowed by the sensationalism of the case. And while Amanda and Raffaele tried to move forward with their lives, the media still thrived on the idea that the case was a riddle that had yet to be solved. The hunt for the real killer became a topic for speculation in countless documentaries, books, and news articles. With every new angle, the case seemed to grow more complex. Was there a killer still out there? Or had the justice system simply failed to bring the real perpetrator to justice? The world may never know, but the uncertainty was enough to keep the story alive in the public's mind for years. As the years passed, Amanda did her best to reclaim her identity. She moved away from the spotlight, choosing to live more privately, though her past was never far behind. She met a man, married, and started a family, but even these joys were tempered by the shadows of her past. The world had made her a character in a tragic story, and now, even as she tried to live as a mother and wife, she couldn't fully escape the role that had been thrust upon her. And yet, despite everything, Amanda began to speak more openly about her experiences, becoming a voice for others who had suffered from wrongful accusations. She used her platform to advocate for criminal justice reform, for the wrongly convicted, and for the protection of people's rights in the face of media sensationalism. She took control of her narrative in ways she never had before, determined to make her voice heard and to help others who had been through similar struggle. In the end, Amanda Knox's story is one of resilience. It's a story of a young woman who, despite the world turning against her, refused to let herself be defined by the lies told about her. She fought for her freedom, and she fought to reclaim her humanity. But even though she had been declared innocent by the courts, the scars of those years in the media and the courtroom would stay with her forever. The case of Amanda Knox may have been legally resolved, but the question of who really killed Meredith Kercher is a haunting mystery that remains unsolved. The next and final story is called The West Memphis 3. It was the spring of 1993, and the small town of West Memphis, Arkansas, was about to be rocked by a tragedy that would leave its mark on the community forever. On May 5th, 3 8-year-old boys went missing without a trace. Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers had spent the day playing in the quiet neighborhood, riding their bikes, laughing, and just being kids. But by nightfall, when their families realized they hadn't returned home, the panic began to set in. Their parents, frantic and desperate, scoured the area, calling out their names, knocking on doors, searching the woods and the nearby creek. Something felt off. These were good kids. They didn't wander off without telling anyone. As hours passed, the uncertainty grew, and so did the fear. They were just gone. The next morning, the police were called in, but there was no sign of the boys anywhere. The investigation was swift, and with each hour that passed, the sense of dread deepened. This wasn't a simple case of kids running away. Something more sinister was at play. Then, the worst possible news arrived. A search team had found their bodies, tangled in the water of a creek in a wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills, just a short distance from where the boys were last seen. But the scene was like something out of a nightmare. This wasn't an accident. The bodies were found in a state that left no question of foul play. The boys were naked, their clothes discarded nearby, and they were bound with their own shoelaces. The most disturbing part, there were signs of brutal torture. The police were left with more questions than answers. How had this happened? And why? Rumors spread like wildfire in the town. Some claimed the boys had been killed by someone they knew. Others whispered about the occult, a disturbing theory that would soon dominate the investigation. With no leads and no suspects, the pressure on the police mounted. A crime like this, in a town like West Memphis, was unheard of. The community wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. But instead of answers, they would get a series of mistakes that would forever alter the lives of 3 young men, and the course of justice. As the police worked through the scene, they began to focus on one disturbing possibility: the nature of the killings. The brutality of it, beyond anything anyone had ever witnessed, was being described as ritualistic. Speculation began to circulate that the killings were the work of satanic cults, groups that were believed to be operating in the shadows of society. The idea was terrifying. If the killings were tied to some kind of dark, supernatural force, what else could be out there? What other secrets lay hidden in this quiet town? Days passed, and the investigation stalled. But then, like something out of a twisted movie, a suspect emerged. Damian Eccles was 18 years old, different from the other teens in West Memphis. He had a dark, brooding presence. He wore black clothes, had long hair, and was into heavy metal music, which led some people to suspect he was involved in Satanism. The town, it seemed, needed someone to blame, and Damien fit the image they had in their heads. What's more, Damien had a reputation that didn't help his case. People said he had a temper, that he was troubled. And that was all it took for the rumor mill to start spinning. But the real twist in the investigation came when police focused on another name, Jesse Miskelly, a 17-year-old with a troubled past. Jesse, who had been friends with Damien and was often seen hanging out with him, was questioned by the police. And in a moment of desperation, Jesse made a confession that would soon come under intense scrutiny. The confession was shocking, detailed, and seemed to paint a clear picture of what had happened to the boys. But there was a problem. Jesse's confession didn't make sense. His story changed over and over again, contradicting the evidence at the crime scene. It was clear to some that Jesse was being coerced. The police, desperate to close the case, began to focus on Damien and his friends, believing they had finally found the answers they were looking for. What followed was a rush to judgment. With no solid evidence, no forensic links, no clear motive, Damien Eccles, Jesse Miskelly, and Jason Baldwin were arrested and charged with the murders of the three boys. The town of West Memphis had its suspects, but the world outside was starting to take notice. The case was more complicated than anyone could have imagined, and the people involved were about to be thrust into a nightmare they hadn't seen coming. The story of the West Memphis Three had just begun, and the questions about the crime, the investigation, and the truth would continue to grow louder, echoing for years to come. The investigation into the deaths of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers quickly turned intense, and the police faced mounting pressure to bring justice to a devastated community. With public fear escalating, the authorities were keen to find a suspect, anyone who could be responsible for a crime so brutal it seemed incomprehensible. As they scrambled for leads, they found themselves drawn to a troubled teen named Damien Eccles. Damien was not like most of the kids in West Memphis. He had an intense, introspective nature and an affinity for dark clothing and heavy metal music, a choice that to some marked him as suspicious, even dangerous. Rumors spread that Damien was interested in occult practices, and as whispers of Satanism began to circulate in the community, authorities zeroed in on him as a possible suspect. The notion of a ritualistic crime gave rise to a climate of fear that soon bordered on hysteria. The police intensified their scrutiny, but they needed more than suspicions to make an arrest. That's when they turned to Jesse Miskelly, a 17-year-old acquaintance of Damien's with a lower intellectual capacity, making him vulnerable in police custody. In a series of interviews, Jesse was subjected to hours of intense questioning, which eventually resulted in a confession. The details Jesse provided seemed to line up with the case, at least on the surface, but it didn't take long for the inconsistencies to appear. Jesse's statements were contradictory, often not matching the known facts of the case, and it became evident that he was confused, scared, and possibly saying what he thought the investigators wanted to hear. Yet, despite the flawed nature of the confession, law enforcement felt they had what they needed. The confession, no matter how shaky, would be the linchpin of their case. With Damien's supposed dark interests, Jesse's testimony, and now a new suspect, Jason Baldwin, a friend of Damien's who had a similar style, the police felt confident that they had identified the perpetrators. To them, this trio fit the narrative of a ritualistic killing, and that was enough to move forward with charges. As the news broke, the community reacted with a mixture of relief and horror. The idea that local teenagers, boys they'd seen around town, could commit such a crime was chilling. Yet, there was a sense of closure in knowing that arrests had been made. What they didn't realize was how deeply flawed the case against the West Memphis Three truly was. The case moved forward swiftly. The town's fervor to see justice served meant that there was little room for questions, little tolerance for doubts. For the three boys, however, their ordeal was just beginning. The investigation was over, but the trial would expose just how much about the case was based on assumptions, bias, and a relentless desire for answers, no matter how they were obtained. The trial of Damien Eccles, Jesse Miskelly, and Jason Baldwin began with an eerie sense of inevitability. The town of West Memphis was convinced that they had found their killers. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of three young men who had killed the boys as part of a twisted ritual, fueled by dark interests and the desire to invoke some kind of evil power. To the public, the case seemed almost like something out of a horror movie, and the three defendants seemed to fit the roles perfectly. But the reality of the trial was far less straightforward. The prosecution's case was based on little more than circumstantial evidence, much of it based on the personalities and appearances of the accused. Damien's goth appearance, his interest in the occult, and his disconnection from mainstream society had all been twisted into a narrative of evil intent. Jason Baldwin, Damien's quiet friend, was painted as complicit simply by association. And Jesse Misskelley, though his confession was riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions, was portrayed as a key witness, the inside man who could tie everything together. The trial was a spectacle, a battle of perception rather than fact. The defense team, underfunded and outmatched, struggled to keep up with the prosecution's strategy. They highlighted the lack of physical evidence. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that could definitively tie the boys to the crime scene. The prosecution, in turn, tried to argue that the absence of physical evidence meant nothing in the face of the psychological evidence of their guilt. One of the most significant pieces of evidence the prosecution leaned on was Jesse Misskelley's confession. Although Jesse had recanted his statement multiple times, claiming he was coerced and confused during the interrogation, the confession was treated as gospel truth. The confession, given under duress and riddled with inaccuracies, was presented to the jury as the key to understanding the murders. Despite Jesse's claims that he was tricked and manipulated by the police, the court seemed to view his testimony as an ironclad admission of guilt. The prosecution also pointed to the manner in which the boys were found, bound, naked, and left in a creek, as evidence of a ritualistic killing. To the police, the gruesome nature of the crime pointed to some form of occult activity, and Damien's lifestyle, his interest in horror movies, heavy metal music, and Satanism, was enough to convince them that he was capable of such brutality. In a town that was already on edge, the idea of a satanic panic was enough to fuel the flames of suspicion. But for those paying close attention, the flaws in the case were glaring. The defense team pointed out the lack of physical evidence, the inconsistencies in Jesse's confession, and the absence of any motive. There was no clear reason why Damien, Jason, or Jesse would have committed such a crime. They had no known connection to the victims, beyond the fact that they lived in the same small town. There was no history of violence, no apparent grudge, nothing that would explain the horrific murders. What became even more apparent as the trial wore on was the role that fear and hysteria played in the case. The town was already on edge, desperate for answers, and when Damien, Jason, and Jesse were arrested, the community latched onto them as the answers they were waiting for. The media, too, had a role in shaping the narrative, focusing on Damien's appearance and his darkness, rather than on the evidence, or lack thereof. It became a case of guilt by association, a perfect storm of fear, bias, and media sensationalism. In the end, despite the overwhelming lack of evidence and the defense's arguments, the jury found all three defendants guilty. Damien Eccles was sentenced to death, while Jesse Misskelley and Jason Baldwin were sentenced to life in prison. The conviction was based on nothing more than the idea that the three were capable of such a crime, an idea fueled by hysteria, flawed confessions, and the undeniable pressure to close the case. The verdict shocked the world. How could three young men, who had no clear motive and no evidence linking them to the crime, be convicted of such a brutal, senseless act? It was a question that would continue to haunt the case for years to come. But for the moment, it seemed like the story was over. The three boys had been convicted, and the town of West Memphis could move on, or so it seemed. What no one knew at the time was that the fight for justice had only just begun. The case would continue to twist and turn for years, with new evidence, new discoveries, and new voices calling for a closer look. And as the three young men languished in prison, their names, once whispered in fear, would become a rallying cry for those who believed in their innocence. But for now, the conviction stood. The West Memphis Three were behind bars, and the families of the victims, still grieving, still searching for answers, were left with the uncomfortable reality that justice for them had not been served. Years passed, and the West Memphis Three, Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Misskelley, remained behind bars. The case, which had seemed so clear-cut in the eyes of the town, was far from over. Though the three young men were convicted, a growing chorus of voices began to question the validity of the trial and the justice of their convictions. The feeling that something was terribly wrong with the case never fully dissipated. While the community tried to move on, the truth began to surface slowly but surely. Over the years, the initial frenzy around the murders gave way to deeper scrutiny, and people began to notice the glaring flaws in the investigation and the trial. More than a decade passed, and it became clear that there were many unanswered questions, and some troubling new evidence that suggested the wrong people had been convicted. The turning point came with the release of Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, a documentary directed by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky. Released in 1996, it brought the West Memphis Three's case into the public eye on a scale that no one could have predicted. The documentary, which focused on the trial and the aftermath, introduced the world to the flaws in the case, exposing the lack of evidence and raising questions about the motivations behind the convictions. It showed Jesse Miskelly's coerced confession, Damien's alleged links to the occult, and the public hysteria that had fueled the prosecution. For the first time, the world saw what the people of West Memphis had refused to acknowledge. The case was built on a foundation of fear, assumption, and unreliable evidence. The documentary attracted attention from outside the small town, and with it came a new wave of support for the West Memphis Three. This was the beginning of a long journey toward justice that would take years to unfold. But it wasn't just the documentary that kept the flame of doubt alive. There were cracks appearing in the case that couldn't be ignored. As the years went by, new forensic evidence came to light, suggesting that the West Memphis Three may have been innocent all along. Advances in DNA testing that weren't available during the original trial began to challenge the conviction. The most significant development came in 2007, when DNA testing excluded the three men as the sources of the blood found at the crime scene. There were no traces of their DNA anywhere near the bodies of the three young victims. In fact, DNA evidence pointed to another person entirely, someone who had never been considered a suspect. With this new evidence in hand, the calls for justice grew louder. The West Memphis Three had spent over a decade in prison, but now, for the first time, there was undeniable proof that they had been wrongfully convicted. Still, the legal system was slow to act, and the case continued to drag on as the fight for their release intensified. Support from various organizations, legal experts, and the public pushed for their exoneration, but the wheels of justice ground slowly. Throughout the ordeal, Damien, Jason, and Jesse each fought to maintain their innocence, despite the overwhelming weight of their convictions. Damien, in particular, became the face of the fight. He spent nearly 18 years on death row, enduring an agonizing and cruel wait for justice. His case had attracted the attention of legal advocates and activists from around the world who believed in his innocence and were determined to help him. Damien's resilience, along with the support of his family, lawyers, and newfound allies, kept the fight alive. As the years wore on, the town of West Memphis remained divided. There were those who still believed in the guilt of the three young men and continued to hold on to the narrative that had been built around them. But there were also those who had come to see the West Memphis Three as victims of a flawed justice system, a system that had been swayed more by fear and sensationalism than by truth and fairness. The legal battles dragged on, with several attempts to have the case reopened and the convictions overturned. But even with the new DNA evidence and the documentary bringing the flaws of the case to light, the road to exoneration was not an easy one. The legal system, entrenched in its original decision, proved difficult to move. Still, with every passing year, the hope of the West Memphis Three's supporters grew stronger. Then, in 2011, after years of legal maneuvering and mounting pressure, the breakthrough finally came. The Arkansas Supreme Court ruled that the case of the West Memphis Three would be reopened, allowing for a new investigation into the evidence. The wheels of justice began to turn, but it would take one more twist before the three men could finally see freedom. It wasn't the DNA evidence alone that would free them, though it had played a major role. The final breakthrough came with the revelation of the Alford plea, an agreement that allowed the three men to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict them. It was a controversial and bittersweet resolution, as it allowed the state to avoid a full admission of guilt while releasing the three men from prison. In August 2011, after nearly 18 years behind bars, Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly were released from prison. But even then, the controversy remained. The Alford plea meant that the state did not fully exonerate them, and it left lingering questions about the true identity of the killer. Yet, for the West Memphis Three, it was a hard-won victory. Their freedom, hard-earned, came at the cost of years lost, lives ruined, and a justice system forever stained by its mistakes. The case of the West Memphis Three would continue to be a symbol of miscarried justice and the dangers of a justice system swayed by fear and public opinion. It was a fight that had taken decades, and even after their release, the truth of what really happened that night in Robin Hood Hills remained elusive. The real killer, whoever they were, remained free. But for the three men who had been wrongfully convicted, their fight for justice had finally come to an end. Yet, for Damien, Jason, and Jesse, the road to healing and redemption would prove just as long and difficult as the years they had spent behind bars. They had been freed, but the scars of their ordeal would never fully fade. The release of Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly in 2011 was a monumental moment, but it marked only the beginning of the difficult journey toward healing and resolution. While the three men were free at last, their lives had been irrevocably altered by the nearly 2 decades they had spent behind bars. For Damien, the longest serving of the three, the experience of being on death row for almost 18 years had left deep psychological scars. The trauma of living in constant fear, of knowing that at any moment his life could be ended by lethal injection, was something no one could truly understand unless they had lived through it. In the years following their release, the West Memphis Three were forced to navigate a world that had moved on without them. Society had changed, the legal landscape had shifted, and the case, once the focus of global attention, had faded into the past for many people. But for the three men, it was impossible to escape the shadows of their wrongful convictions. They found themselves constantly haunted by the years lost, by the faces of the 3 young boys whose deaths had led to their imprisonment, and by the fact that the true killer, or killers, had never been brought to justice. The legal system had failed them in the most profound way. But perhaps the hardest truth to face was that, even with their release, they would never be able to fully erase the stain of being branded as murderers. Even after their names were cleared in the public eye, the stigma remained. Some in the town of West Memphis still believed they were guilty, and the victims' families were left to grapple with the unsettling realization that they may never know who was truly responsible for their sons' deaths. The pain of being falsely accused and convicted wasn't something that could simply be healed with freedom. For Damien especially, the years spent on death row had deeply affected his mental health. He had been forced to live in a world where time didn't move forward, where each day felt like a repeat of the last. He was kept in solitary confinement for long stretches, unable to even see the sun for months at a time, isolated in a small, cold cell, where the only sounds were the echoes of his own thoughts. Over time, it became clear to Damien that he had to find a way to survive this mental torture. He turned inward, developing a deep relationship with his own thoughts, reading books, and writing in journals. In his writing, Damien found a way to process the rage, confusion, and sorrow he felt, and it became his primary means of communication with the outside world. But no matter how much writing he did or how many books he read, there was no escaping the trauma. Damien and Jason, though they had been freed, still lived with the unshakable weight of the years they had spent in prison. Their lives, in many ways, had been stolen from them. For Jesse, the struggle was different, but no less painful. Having been coerced into a false confession, he struggled to live with the guilt of having played a part, however unwittingly, in his own conviction. The years of manipulation, fear, and police custody had left him emotionally scarred. He had spent years trying to understand the psychology behind his confession, but it was impossible to make sense of it. He had been a teenager, scared and confused, and he had caved under the pressure. The case of the West Memphis Three became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the criminal justice system, a system that had failed not just 3 young men, but an entire community. The town of West Memphis, which had once been so convinced of their guilt, now faced a growing realization that they may have been complicit in a miscarriage of justice. The case drew national and international attention, sparking a debate about the flaws in the criminal justice system, the dangers of panic-driven investigations, and the lengths to which law enforcement and the media could go to find a scapegoat. The release of the 3 men also led to public scrutiny of the prosecution. The people who had once believed in the case against the West Memphis Three began to ask uncomfortable questions. Had they been wrong? Had the rush to judgment, fueled by fear and public hysteria, led to the wrongful conviction of 3 innocent boys? The town had to come to terms with the fact that their justice system had failed them. But while the case was reopening old wounds for the people of West Memphis, it was also reopening old questions. The true killer remained at large, and the lack of answers regarding the murders of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers only deepened the pain for the victims' families. Though the West Memphis Three had been freed, the case was far from over. As the years went by, the legal fight for the West Memphis Three became less about securing their freedom and more about finding closure. The real killer, or killers, still roamed free, and that truth gnawed at the hearts of everyone involved. It was clear that the justice system had failed on multiple levels, from the initial investigation to the trial to the years of wrongful imprisonment. Even though the 3 men were free, the unanswered questions still lingered, casting a shadow over their lives. In the aftermath of their release, the 3 men tried to rebuild their lives, but the damage had already been done. Damien Eccles, now living on the outside for the first time in nearly 2 decades, struggled to find a place in a world that had passed him by. He had to start from scratch, making new friends, trying to re-establish relationships with family, and learning to live with the stigma of a past that could never be fully erased. Jason Baldwin, who had spent years behind bars, also struggled to adjust. Though his innocence was now recognized by the world, he found it difficult to put the past behind him. For Jesse Miskelly, the burden of his false confession continued to haunt him even after his release. The emotional scars of those years in police custody were not easily healed. Despite the pain, there was hope that the case would eventually be solved, that the true killer would be brought to justice, and that their wrongful conviction would finally be erased from the public consciousness. But as the years went on, the question lingered. Who was responsible for the deaths of those 3 young boys? And how many more innocent people would have to suffer before the truth was uncovered? In the end, the case of the West Memphis Three remains a haunting reminder of the flaws in the criminal justice system, the dangers of panic-driven investigations, and the enduring quest for justice. The release of Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly did not bring complete closure, not for them, not for the victims' families, and certainly not for the world. The search for the truth continues, and the scars of the past are still felt deeply by all involved. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Chill Thrill Stories. If you found these perplexing and controversial cases as captivating as we did, please give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. Your engagement helps us create more content that delves into the strange, dark, and mysterious. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our weekly uploads. There's always more to uncover and discuss in the world of true crime and mystery. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay thrilled.